Hi there, I'm Henry Bechelet, the Technical Manager for ICL UK and Ireland, and I'm here with Dr. Andy Owen, who is the International Tech Manager for ICL, Turf and Landscape. And we're also really pleased to be joined by Glenn Kirby from Syngenta, who is going to give us the benefit of all his experience and expertise in the area of fungicide. Okay, so this is the third installment of our series of technical update videos on the subject of Microdochium patch disease management. And in this episode, with the help of Glenn, we're going to turn our attention to fungicides. So far, we've covered a background to Microdochium patch disease and the factors of favour its development. And we've also talked, myself and Andy, about what ITM is. But in this chat, we're going to move things forward by trying to get a better understanding of fungicide technology. So firstly, Glenn, thanks for coming. And can we start off by you briefly telling us about your career and your current role with Syngenta?
Yeah, thanks, Henry. It's good to be here. So I have been with Syngenta just over 2 years now. My previous role was as a golf course manager, and the first 20 to 25 years of my career were very much on the tools, being out on the golf course and in sports grounds and working with turf. So I hit that frightening 40th birthday and started to look for alternative things in my career to use my expertise or my background and experience, and here I am. So working in slightly different, but using the experience.
That's great, because I mean, obviously it's all about practical experience, isn't it? And so I think that's what I found with you, actually. It's sort of getting to know you, that that's what you really do bring to the table, that sort of marrying up technical and practical expertise. Okay, so look, we've got lots going on in the area of sort of fungicides, haven't we? And I suppose the big question that's on a lot of people's minds, Glenn, is with the loss of active ingredients that we've had in recent years from the industry, I suppose the burning question is, can we still manage Microdochium patch disease effectively with fungicides?
Yes, and yes, we can. There has definitely been a reduction in available chemistry for the customer, but that's not to be confused with losing products altogether. We have definitely seen a change in the direction recently. There has been withdrawals going on quicker than there has been products coming to market. But it's important to recognise the development that's going on behind the scenes, and with the ever-tightening regulations that are in place, the speed we can bring products to market is slower than they will disappear. But we are working on some really exciting technology. There's great stuff in the pipeline. And as we get to grips more and more with the regulations, the tightening up of all of that, we will continue to bring good products to market. But they may be a little slower to get to market than we were hoping
for. Okay. I mean, we found that, Andy, don't we, with our trials, that whenever we put, even the fungicides that sort of remain now into our trials as a positive control, possibly, they just work brilliantly, and I think that fear of the loss of the old favourites is maybe just a little bit misplaced.
There is a learning curve with the newer technology. It is different technology to you had before. It is safer technology. It is more effective. It's lower dose rates. It's better for the environment. The regulatory pressure is mainly built around safety and improving its safety in the environment. So the products that are coming to market are incredibly safe and effective, and they have to go through much higher levels of stewardship and research and data to support it than any other products we're using in the market. And that means that we've got to learn how to use these things, and they are not massive great sledgehammers that we've had before that will allow you to manage your turf, your ITM strategies in a way of purely focusing on putting surfaces and ignore everything else and solve your problem with this chemistry. They are things that have to be integrated into those programs and be used as part of the strategy. And that's what these regulations are all about, is making sure that people are doing this responsibly and they're thinking about the whole thing rather than purely relying on chemistry.
Yeah,
That's
I think
good.
that's right. Yeah, Andy, do you want to just chip in?
Yes, I never get a word in. That's really good to hear, Glenn. Obviously, Henry and I are working with these technologies. We're aware of how effective they are as long as you use them in the right way. And it's nice to hear you introduce or talk about integrated practices, because that's very much the focus of these series of technical updates. If we lead on from that question, one of the things I've seen you speak about before that I found really interesting that sort of links to that is this area of every site having its own tolerance for disease, or what's acceptable on their surface. Could you explain that a little bit further, and how you see that being an important sort of decision or idea to run with?
Yeah, I talk about that a lot when I go around and do demonstrations out in the field, because I think it's really useful for people to understand what a percentage of disease looks like, and therefore you can start understanding how effective the technology is at reducing that disease pressure. Now, I use tiddlywinks to explain to people the percentage area and what it looks like in real life. And I do that to make the point of just how important it is we keep control of the amount of disease. This is about massive reductions in disease populations, because what is acceptable on turf for golfers is tiny, tiny percentages, like 0.5%, 0.25% is almost on the verge of not being tolerated. And that is so important to start with that position in your mindset of how do we need to tighten down. And I do that because I want people to understand how important it is to put a strategy together at the beginning of the season. Now, I noticed in my career how I used to talk quite a lot about IPM, integrated pest management, and that has evolved into ITM. I'm not sure where you guys are on that strategy, but for me, that's a fundamental shift in purely focusing on the pest management and solving this problem. And it has now evolved to turf management, which is a much bigger picture. It's collaborating and connecting the putting surface you're trying to create along with the tools you have available and making them all fit in together. Now, that now opens it up to things like clearing trees out so you've got better airflow, and all of these things are connected. It's not just one thing. It's better airflow, it's better turf management, it's less stress, it's getting your fertility program right, it's getting your timings right, and sliding those fungicides in at the right time when pressure is too much to cope with. It's not about relying on that chemistry all the way through. It's pinpointing when is the best time to use it, and that's how you can get the best out of these technologies.
Yeah, I think I couldn't agree more. I'm quite pleased, we did mention that in the previous episode, very much what you were just sort of saying then. And I do think this idea, I do think we're right to bring up this whole thing about zero tolerance, that's certain venues or certain greenkeepers, the level of expectation or the sort of demands that are placed on these technologies, for instance, and sometimes when they're just being used standalone, not even in an integrated strategy, is kind of it would be really difficult to achieve. And so to achieve these kind of really high levels of control, we do have to be integrated. We do have to do everything that we can. We can't just expect a fungicide to miraculously keep everything super clean, can we? So I think that there's that sort of perception and there's that attitude that we need to get right if we're going to sort of proceed with our management strategy.
Yeah, I really like that answer, Glenn. Really, really clear, I think. If we take the next step, and Henry just touched on it there will be sites that are looking to keep their turf 100% clean. And if we're talking specifically about Microdochium, have you got some guideline tips? What's the best practice approach for a site that wants to keep things absolutely clean?
Yeah, and I think it's probably more than we realise, because when you start looking at the trial data and you start looking at the tiddlywink experiment, and that I do. It's rare that anybody will accept anything higher than 1% disease. So they're all looking at massive, the whole industry is looking for pretty close to 100% disease control. It's whether they're prepared to tolerate, you know, and when you start really looking at the figures, it's whether they're prepared to tolerate a little bit or none. So the whole industry is looking to do that. The key factors for me are starting early. There is this whole pressure going on where disease populations are ramping up through the autumn. And as we go through these milder winters, that period is longer and longer and longer. But what I see all the time is those that try and reduce their disease population by going later, and sorry, if they try and reduce the amount of fungicides they use by going later with it and trying to edge things out, they always end up chasing their tail at the back end of the year. And then they generally use more fungicides than they would have previously, and they have a lower quality potting surface. Whereas the key to all programs, whether it be prepared to accept a little bit or prepared to accept none, is starting early, because it's much easier to back off than to recover it from a situation where you've got more disease. So the key is get all of your ITM pieces in place, get all of that stuff going on, all the other bits that I'm sure you're talking about in these series, but with your fungicide specifically, the earlier you start, the more chance you've got of keeping that disease population low and giving yourself a chance to manage a disease-free surface.
Yeah, well, and we do always get this kind of like, we're in this difficult position of kind of like people maybe or greenkeepers with maybe more cynical sort of mindset. So saying, well, you would say that, wouldn't you? You know, you're just trying to get us to use more fungicide, but it's not true. It's kind of, no, if you want to keep things clean, and if you want to sort of stand a chance of using less fungicides, you have to use them at the right time, and that's early. Once you start sort of having to chase your tail, you know, not only have the playing qualities of the surfaces declined, you do all of a sudden start, you know, using more than you wanted to anyway. And so it's a really difficult thing to sort of gain people's trust with, really, more than anything. That actually, that's the best advice.
There is an interesting... Go on, Glenn, over to you.
Sorry, I was going to say, in all the trial data we do, and all the trials we put together, it consistently supports this best practice of going early. And part of the problem we have is there are 3 guys here with quite a bit of experience in this area who've looked at trials all the time. And we've probably all got a slightly different perception of what preventative means in all 3 of our heads. That communication around the industry of what does a preventative application look like. We are not saying, well, I'm not saying put it down in the middle of August because at some point in September you're going to get disease pressure. This is about understanding your site, understanding your pressure, your grass species, what goes on with you, and getting your timing just right in before you start to see it ramp up. Now, everybody looks at that differently, and that is the difficult thing about communicating this message.
So, I mean, I think this right. Sorry, I will stop rabbiting in a minute. But, you know, the difference between what we're talking about is maybe 3 or 4 days, aren't we? Rather than sort of like you know, radically changing your attitude. It's almost like just getting that little bit earlier. But the difficulty is kind of like, okay, well, tell me when I should be applying my fungicide. When, you know, the difference between now and 3 and 4 days later will have no difference in terms of how the turf looks. So how do I know when to get that timing right?
Yeah, well, you know, if you've got to look at what you've done historically. If you've historically been caught out on a regular basis and it's got away from you quicker than you would like, there's a good chance, there's a strong indication in your spray records showing you when you sprayed every year for the last 2 or 3 years. And you want to have a look at that, and that's when you want to be paying particular attention. The other thing to think about is renovation weeks. So August is a notoriously bad time. We all kind of think August can be a great period of hot weather. Actually, it's seen quite a lot of rainfall in recent years. You get a bit of humidity, you're starting to get heavier dew sitting around. We tend to tie renovation weeks into those periods, and you can get caught out in those periods too. So if you've got a maintenance operation going on that is going to be detrimental if you get disease pressure, you probably want to go preventative in before that maintenance pressure. And this is all about back to your ITM strategy of thinking about what it is you're doing and what impact is that going to have. So the same site, Same site, renovation program or no renovation program, I would go with different fungicide programs. I would leave it a little bit later, but if I knew I was going to start verticutting into it, covering it in sand and putting additional fertilizer on, that would then put me in a preventative fungicide frame of mind to make sure just before that renovation week I came through it clean. Otherwise, yeah, you can just look at what's going on, and we've got the Greencast website, which has got some good tools on there to help people look at that. It is tricky. There's no getting away from that. There isn't a simple answer, but you've probably got enough historic records to start giving you a clue into when your timings are right.
Okay, can I just jump in now, and just with the point really, because we're talking about fungicides as if they're all the same, and we're talking, or if they all do the same thing, and they don't. You know, you look at the sort of Syngenta portfolio, but other sort of fungicides, there's different modes of action going on, and there's different sort of timings. You know, how, you know, is this where the sort of the area sales managers really do come into their own, or you know, what's the sort of rules of thumb when it comes to sort of systemics and contacts and stuff like that? I mean, I think it's too long for I think it's too big for this particular discussion, but we need to make that point that different fungicides have different attributes or different qualities or different chemistries that require you to understand them in order to get them right.
Yeah, I think it's imperative that we understand what's going on with the bottle that you're putting in your spray tank. Understanding whether it's a systemic or contact or a mix of two different types in there is key. Rule of thumb is if it's a systemic, you want to be applying it whilst the plant is growing, so it's getting recycled and taken up through that plant. If the plant is not growing or it's very, very slow, you want a contact type fungicide. And if it's somewhere in the middle, you want two different types of activity going on in there. So we kind of stick to that.
It is as simple as that, isn't it? In lots of ways, you know, there is lots of sort of terminology, you know, acropetal penetrance and all this kind of stuff, which kind of describes sort of very complex things. But actually, we don't need to sort of, you know, confuse ourselves with those things. You know,
yeah, and you know, we've seen so contact-wise, medallion on the market.
Andy, have you lost Glenn?
I just gone quiet a sec there, Glenn.
Okay. Well, look, let's kind of let's not let this kind of destroy matters.
I think that's good. I was just going to say both Henry and yourself answered the question I was trying to jump in with about how do we give a little more advice about timing and how do we select the right product for the right time. And I think that you both covered that fairly nicely about the timings and approaches. And I think we boxed off the fact that there's, you know, different fungicide types and we need to understand them to use them in the right way. I'm conscious of time and would like to keep moving if that's okay, and really takes us through to the sort of last bit of advice, Glenn, is perhaps in the application. How do you get maximum benefit from the fungicide you're using? What are the key tips for the turf managers there to make sure they're hitting in terms of their application?
Yeah, so really key area for me. Application wise, we need to register and be very conscious that every little bit of that product counts. These products, when they're being registered now, go through this minimum effective dosing. So they're really looked at. We work really hard to work out what is an effective dose of that fungicide, and we are not over applying it. So when these products get registered, we have to prove that it works at this rate. And if you start reducing the rates, then you are going to lose efficacy on them. So you've got to get everything out of it. Now, at the same time as we've gone through this change in kind of how products are registered, we've also seen this uprise in auto rate controllers on sprayers, which have taken calibration of sprayers out of hands. So we've got to work really hard to control pressure. That is number one for me, because you need enough pressure to make sure you've got really good coverage from your nozzle, but not too much pressure that you start losing freeze drift. You've got to get really good nozzles on there. You've got to use nozzles that are specifically designed for turf. Make sure it's all calibrated correctly, and then understand the product you're putting on and get the right water volume for it. Again, we do so much spraying these days through liquid nutrition and plant growth regulators that what I tend to find when I go visit people is their sprayers are set up at one spray setting, and that goes out through everything because they're using it so often. If we've got key products and we're all recognizing how critical it is we get the most out of this fungicide application when it goes on, because it's going to be pieced into an ITM strategy and it's critical to get this absolutely right, take the time to set your sprayer up for that application. If that means reducing the pressure and upping the water volume or slowing down or doing something, just take the time to think about that product and getting it right. So educate yourself on what's going to get the best out of that product and take time to set your sprayer up out of it. So that's going to take a bit of work to understand the product. Talk to your guys on the road that know what they're talking about. If you can't get the answers you're looking for, come find myself, and then set your sprayer up properly for it. It's so much, it's worth the effort.
It's good advice.
You can't have a zero tolerance attitude, kind of almost like be slapdash in the way in which you apply this stuff. Do you know what I mean? It's kind of like you've got, if we accept the challenge of zero tolerance, but that requires everyone to get everything right. Okay, so that's great. Andy, are you happy with that, Glenn?
Yeah, very happy. Really interesting.
We covered a lot of ground there. There's so much more than we could cover. But I think we've got some take-home messages. First of all, fungicides form part of an integrated approach. And so if we have this zero tolerance attitude, or we want to achieve effective disease control, fungicides are a part of a bigger plan. And that bigger plan is a turf management plan rather than just a disease management plan. We've got to be preventative if we're going to get the best out of our fungicides. We've got to understand the products. We're going to sort of time them correctly, and we've got to apply them correctly as well. So there's lots of things to think about. We can't just buy this stuff, chuck it on, and expect it to work. But above all, it's integrated, isn't it? That's the take-home message. That's what this whole series is about. That sort of fungicides are a part of a bigger plan. All right, so thanks, Glenn. That was really great. And also thanks, Andy, for your always wise words.
Thanks.
Also, thanks to also thanks to everyone for joining this episode. I hope you found it helpful and that you'll look out for the other episodes. And that's it. So hopefully see you again soon, and goodbye for now.
Bye.
Thanks, guys.